So you should now be seeing my slides. I hope.
Yeah. Yeah.
Good. Okay, so the slides are not actually terribly useful, to be honest. I'm just using them more to keep myself on track. So I have some expertise in information.
Sorry, Rónán, can you make them full screen?
Yeah, let me see. Is that better?
Yeah, perfect.
Great. Yeah, so I have some expertise in information technology law, but not an awful lot of experience of working with archives. And therefore, I'm going to probably raise more questions than necessarily provide answers. But I just wanted to reflect a little bit on some of the detailed provisions of the GDPR and also touch on some of the issues that have come up already this morning, and point out a couple of things that might merit a little bit of discussion. The first is that the GDPR sets down a number of different principles, and I'm certainly not going to go through those in a lot of detail. But these were touched on earlier in some of the presentations, and I think that one of the things we need to bear in mind is that these principles, as was said earlier, are somewhat abstract because they're developed by lawyers, and we're quite comfortable in working with these kinds of abstract principles. But translating these into code that can be used by a computer in order to manage access to data is not necessarily straightforward. We also need to think a little bit about what the actual lawful basis for processing is, which is required. And in many cases for archives, that will be whether or not that will be that the processing is necessary for the performance of a task that's carried out in the public interest. Whether or not something is in the public interest will depend on the mission of the institution. It doesn't actually require public ownership as such. You can have a private archive which serves a public interest. But that is something that maybe needs to be touched on. And in the context of archives, I think a particular challenge is if you're going to rely on some other legal basis, particularly consent, you need to treat that very carefully because consent needs to be revocable, essentially, as that makes it difficult. I'm certainly not going to go through the detail of this part of the GDPR of Article 89, but essentially what this talks about is the idea that data will be safeguarded, and particularly focuses on the idea of data minimization. And I think that that's a particularly challenging issue for archives where the law says you need to store as little as possible. Archivists want to store as much as possible. How can that be, in fact, achieved in practice? We also need to bear in mind that data subjects have a variety of rights. They have a right to access, for example, information about what is being held about them. They have a right to access that information. Most importantly, I think for archivists, they have a right to rectify that information, to perhaps erase it or to restrict it. How can that be done while still respecting the integrity of the archive is, I think, probably a challenge in practice. And again, I don't have a lot of experience in archives as such, so perhaps there are solutions out there already. But maybe there are things that can be done, such as supplementary statements, which can be added to a record, or restrictions that can be placed on a record until the data subject essentially dies and no longer has a data protection rights. There are questions around special categories of data and whether or not they can be processed. That can be done for archiving processes in the public interest or for historical research, but perhaps again it might be best to exclude that kind of access to special category data, although that kind of data is often also the type of data that's most interesting, and we've heard about some of that in the presentations in the first session. I'm going to just, in the interest of time, I'm going to skip over that, but also wanted just to flag there are a variety of other different issues, and one that I haven't heard very much discussion of this morning, but does somewhat echo, I think, what Gareth just said in the last presentation there, which is that the GDPR requires that in any system that is developed or any process of processing that there is attention paid to data protection by design, and more importantly, data protection by default. And that means that if you're making choices, first of all, you need to bear data protection in mind, but also if you're making choices in that design process, then you need to choose the option that best protects that data, that limits access to it, that perhaps doesn't gather it in the first place, or only keeps it for as long as is necessary, and perhaps prevents people from gaining access to it. And I think that's a key tension in this area. In that archivists want archives to be open. That's essentially what this workshop is about. but the law directs you to close things off as much as possible. But perhaps there's other interpretations of data protection by default, which don't necessarily lead towards closing. And there are other issues that have been touched on as well in some of the earlier sessions, such as a data protection impact assessment, which is required for high-risk processing, for example, and the need to have some sort of record of processing and how that can be done in a fashion that isn't simply ticking the boxes, that really gets people to think about, well, what data are we processing, and how do we do that in a way that not only respects the law, that's the place from which I would start, but I think it's also important to pick up the point that Gareth made in his presentation, that what is legal is not necessarily ethical. So we need to think about the broader social ramifications of the choices that we're making. And to conclude, from a strictly legal perspective, those who want to know more about this, there is a very useful document by the European Archives Groups on guidance on data protection archive service. There's quite a long URL for that. I might put that in the chat after this session is over, but it's easy enough to find based on that title on a quick Google search. So thank you very much for your attention. I look forward to questions and comments in the discussion afterward.